everyone. You all look wonderful, so many in your red, white, and blue. We're so grateful to have you, friends, members, guests, people back there, speaker only. We're grateful to have you all today. Thank you for coming. So I'd like to just open, and I'm going to open with an American piece, an Americanism piece. Our friend Barbara Witcher is having some health issues, so I'm pinch hitting for her today. What Price Freedom by Paul Harvey. The question often has been asked, what happened to those men who signed the Declaration of Independence? Paul Harvey, noted radio commentator and writer, answered the question in an article entitled, What Price Freedom? Here's what he found. 5 signers were captured by the British as traitors and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons in the Revolutionary Army. 1 of the signers had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 fought and died of wounds or the hardships of the Revolutionary War. But what kind of men were they, these men who boldly wrote their names to the Declaration that lit the fires of liberty in souls of men throughout the world? 24 were lawyers and jurists. 11 were merchants. 9 were farmers and large plantation owners, men of means, well-educated. Their security, their incomes, and their worldly possessions made them substantially well off. But they signed the Declaration of Independence even though they knew the penalty would be death or the gallows. If they were captured, they signed and they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter and trader, saw his ship swept from the seas by the British Navy. He sold his home and his properties to pay his debts, and he died in rags. Thomas McKean was so hounded by the enemy that he was forced to move his family almost constantly. He served in the Congress without pay, and his family was kept in hiding. His possessions were taken from him, and poverty was his reward. Vandals or soldiers, or both, looted the properties of Ellery Clymer, Hall, Walton, Gwinnett, Hayward, Rutledge, and Middleton. At the Battle of Yorktown, Thomas Nelson Jr. noted that the British General Cornwallis had taken over the Nelson home for his headquarters. The owner quietly urged General George Washington to open fire, which was done. The home was destroyed, and Nelson died bankrupt. His grave is unmarked and unknown. Francis Lewis had his home and property destroyed. The enemy jailed his wife, and she died within a few months. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside as she was dying. Their 13 children fled for their lives. His field and his grist mill were laid waste. For more than a year, he lived in forests and caves, returning home after the war to find his wife dead and his children vanished. A few weeks later, he died from exhaustion and a broken heart. Morris and Livingston suffered similar fates. Such were the stories and sacrifices of the American Revolution. These were not wild-eyed, rabble-rousing ruffians. These were soft-spoken men of means, wealth, and education. They had security, but they valued liberty more. Standing tall and straight and unwavering, they pledged, for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. And now you know the rest of the story. Paul Harvey. Isn't that amazing? I know that's a heavy thought. All of us are going to be sacrificing over the next years because we're going to be fighting against the left and Marxist left. So we'll be here to support you all. Now I have a dear friend, Pamela Manser, a member of ours. She's going to come up, and I just want her to give a brief light little Americanism piece.
Good morning. This is a Ronald Reagan story. I don't know if you know this or not, even till today, when you want to buy a car in Russia, it takes 10 years to make that purchase. And so you go there, you pick out your car, you pay your money, and they tell you what date you can come and pick up your car in 10 years. So the gentleman said to the Russian agent, would that be in the morning or the afternoon of that day? And the agent said, what difference could it possibly make? And he goes, the plumber's coming in the morning.
Over 10 years. That's great. Thank you, Pamela. Oh, that's great. I know you needed that little levity after the heavy Americanism. And now I'd like to bring up Steve Thomason. Steve, come on up. Steve is gonna bring us in prayer. Okay. Steve is our interim chaplain because Barbara is not feeling well, but thank you, Steve, for coming.
Yes. We're praying for Barbara's recovery. So I don't want to take over her job, right? Let's pray together. Blessed are you, Lord, creator of the universe, who brings wine and bread to our table. Lord, we're so grateful that we hopefully represent your values in this crazy culture that we're in. We need your direction, that we might be your people with integrity, and we need truth so that we can accurately represent your values. In Jesus' name.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, now I'd like to bring up our first VP of Programs, Ro Kendall, to Carol, you know what? I keep forgetting the Pledge of Allegiance. Carol, thank you. Oh, my golly. I ask you all to stand, please? We're going to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance to our amazing country.
Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, for all. Thank you.
Carol says, I'm forgiven. Carol was our president for 3 years. During COVID, I should say. Okay, now I want to bring up Ro Kendall, our VP of Programs, to introduce our honored guests. There you go, Ro.
Hi, everybody. So glad that you came out. It's a wonderful day, and the sun's shining, and finally, we're all together again. Thank you. I'm so honored to be able to introduce and welcome our speakers today, Wayne and Cindy Scott. They have such a long bio that I can't go over all of it because they're so accomplished and wonderful, wonderful patriots, I will say patriots. It's a funny story. I want to ask Cindy how long they've been together because they actually met when they were in 6th grade. Somebody do some math. No, okay, we won't. But Cindy was actually born in the Philippines and came to the United States when she was 11 years old and met Wayne right away. That's about 6th grade, right? So they've been together ever since, and she's been with him throughout his military career, which was 29 years, as, I have to get this right, Communications and Information Officer in the United States Air Force. Yes. He retired from the Air Force in November of 2005, and right away they got on it, and they both became docents at the Nixon Library. They moved to Yorba Linda, and they just don't stop. If this is what retired is, then, you know, we're all kind of retired, aren't we? But they never stop moving, and they keep going. They have so many different interests. Cindy has a very vast lifetime of service. In fact, they both spent 25 years in a marriage ministry. I guess that's how, I guess that's what it took. Oops. Okay. So, and she's been a docent at the library since '06. She served as the first city leader for a new community service program called Love Yorba Linda. And it was the first time that they had this program. She did such a great job that they awarded her Person of the Year for the following year for her contributions to Yorba Linda. And in addition to writing, Cindy is also an accomplished artist. And I'm so excited I just bought her book. It's at the back table. So I'm really, really excited to learn more about her story. And Wayne, of course, he hasn't stopped. He's an employee. He is the regional vice president of Ray Vets, the Raytheon Employee Veterans Network. And he is also on the board of directors of the Yorba Linda Veterans Memorial Association. And, from 2010 to 2019, they planned and conducted, both of them together, planned and conducted the annual Honoring Hometown Heroes ceremony of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. And in 2019, Wayne joined the Freedom Committee of Orange County. I'm sure there's much more, but I have to stop. Otherwise, this lunch is going to be too long. But if you'll please help me to welcome Wayne and Cindy Scott.
We will cover that, actually.
San Gabriel, California.
Thank you. Well, first of all, everyone, thank you so much for inviting us today. We are more than honored to be here with you and to share my mom's story, actually, a young woman's gripping account of faith, courage, and survival before, during, and after World War II. But before I start, just a little bit about us. So, Ro, thank you for that introduction. Wayne, this is my Vanna White here today. So, people think, when we were in the Air Force for 29 years, and we would tell them, Wayne's in the Air Force, people just assumed we met at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Well, that's further from the truth, because I moved here in 1964 to LA, started school in the 6th grade, and met Wayne. In fact, his mom remembers, she says this, she says, I remember him coming home that day, sitting at the dinner table and saying, there's a new girl at school today, and she's from the Philippines. And that is how we met. And today we have 2 sons, 4 grandchildren, and of course 2 daughter-in-laws, and 29 years in the Air Force, and we are coming up on 50 years next month. So, let's begin. I am sure that each of you here today have a story to tell. We all have a story to tell, right? But today I'm going to tell you the story of Marion Gent. This is a biographical, historical, and inspirational story. Of course, I personally love reading this kind of book. So, what's the purpose of a biography? Why does somebody write a biography? It's to share the life of another person with you, an audience, others. It's an account of someone else's life written by someone else. But a good biography presents the facts about a person's life, including what the subject did. What did she or he do? And what kind of a difference did they make in the world? You should tell the story in an interesting way, how that person was, and how she acted, how responded to others. So that's a biography. This is also a historical book. So a historical context refers to the social, religious, economic, and political time of that day. So this book is actually before, during, and after World War II. That is the time that it's set. And this is set on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. We'll talk about that just in a few moments. In the very back of the book, by the way, there are 7 appendices on the Battle of Manila, the Battle of Bataan, MacArthur, Spanish-American War, Philippine-American War, and a person, an educator called Dr. Frank Laubach. Any of you here ever heard of him? Laubach literacy? Anyone here in education? You did. Okay, Laubach, Frank Laubach. There's an appendix in the back of the book about him. What's interesting is that he was a missionary in the Philippines at the time my mom was living there during World War II. And he is the one who started, and maybe you're familiar with the phrase, each one, teach one. Anyone ever heard of that? Okay. Dr. Frank Laubach began that program in the Philippines, taught the Muslims their written alphabet, where they had never, ever had a written alphabet ever in the history. He wrote that alphabet for them. Well, that man was my grandfather's best friend. He actually was my mom's second father. There is an appendix for that. Now, my microphone's out. On? Okay, so the third thing about the book, it's inspirational. Inspired people have two traits. They believe in themselves, they believe in others. Traits that make those around them want to leap further, want to, do better. So inspiration is actually something that comes from inside us. It inspires the reader to do or want to create something good, to go on. This is that story of Never Forsaken. So over here is a picture of a globe between Manila and California. 7,300 miles to get across that ocean. And next slide is actually a map of the Philippines. Has anyone here ever been to the Philippines? Whoa, actually that is quite a number of people. Wow, so over here on the bottom of the map is actually the island of Mindanao. This is the second largest island in the Philippines. Then the other island is Luzon and Manila. This is where the story takes place, mostly on the island of Mindanao. Now, in the Philippines, by the way, there are 7,600 islands. Only 2,000 of them are inhabited. Can you believe that many islands? So Mindanao is the second largest. Actually, I was born in Manila, over there. So the story is set Mindanao and Manila. And over here on this map, see the red lettering of places? That's actually where the story takes place. That is where mostly my mom's story ends up. There's a Mamungan over there. Wayne can point to it. That's where the story takes place. That's where my mom was born. It was an area where American veterans actually ended up settling after the Spanish-American War, where my grandfather fought in that war, Philippine-American War, and then World War II. Now, in this book, Never Forsaken, I actually write a section in the beginning of the book called Terms and Places, so that as you read the book, you will be familiar with some of these words and areas in the Philippines. You may think that the words are hard to sound out, but they're not. They're actually just syllables. You just sound out those syllables, and you're able to say the word. Now, I don't want to give the story away, but I do want to give background of the book. So, back in the 14th century, Arab Muslims, merchants, missionaries actually came to this island of Mindanao. And this is the area where my grandfather built his plantation, Mamungan. And today, this area is actually the most dangerous place in the Philippines to live, is this area. It is where the Abu Sayyaf, anyone heard of the Abu Sayyaf? It's a very, very dangerous militant group. That is where their headquarters is today, the area where my mom was born. So it is Mamungan back then. Today it's actually called Marawi, the town of Marawi. I don't know if you remember, there was a story years ago about a kidnapping. Missionaries had been kidnapped. The husband had been killed. That is that area, and Abu Sayyaf. So that is the area where they live today. Now, my grandfather, William Gent, a little bit of background of the book, fought in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and he actually went up San Juan Hill in Cuba. Not a Rough Rider, but he did fight in Cuba. Again, he was an American veteran of Kentucky. Both wars are actually at the end of in the book. And at this time, I'll tell you the year 1901, my grandfather got out of the U.S. military, ended up staying in this area. But that was the year that the United States first sent teachers, educators, doctors from the U.S. to the Philippines. That is the very first time then that the U.S. educational system was started in the country of the Philippines, was in 1901. Interestingly, my great-grandfather on my dad's side is actually from Spain. So I am Filipino, Spanish, Chinese American, Scot-Irish from my grandfather from Kentucky. I hope you can recite that all later, okay? Now, since the Philippines was under Spain for 350 years, a long time. My great-grandfather from Spain was actually a teacher, and he was sent from Spain to the Philippines to teach the Filipino Spanish because Spain didn't want the Filipinos to speak their own language, Tagalog. So when my grandfather met my Lola, my grandmother, he didn't speak Tagalog, she didn't speak English, and he proposed to her through an interpreter. He was 27 and she was 19 and got married in 1904. Now, the next picture here, this is the plantation that my grandfather built when he acquired a land grant from the United States. When he got out of the military, the U.S. government gave him 50 acres on Mamungan, and he built this house, this plantation house, and he built a coconut plantation. Mom used to say in the book, rows and rows of coconut trees, fruit trees, chickens, cows, and then a river that ran right through their plantation. Just imagine, at that time, this was such a magical place for a young girl and her 11 siblings. She was the youngest of 13 children. Now, the next photo here is actually of my grandfather. Is there a photo of the plantation? Photo painting? Oh, no, that's what I was going to show you. Here we go. You saw a photo of the plantation. Vanna White, could you hold that up, please? So, I painted this oil painting for my mom for her 80th birthday. This is that same plantation house there that my grandfather built in 1912.
Hey, just a comment. When she painted, obviously you can see the photograph is black and white. Cindy kind of guessed what it might look like, and when she gave this to her mom said, "How did you manage to capture the actual colors of what it really looked like?" So made it even more special that she was able to properly interpret that and in essence, colorize an old photograph.
I mean, can you imagine a coconut plantation with rows and rows of coconut trees? My mom used to say that when she would walk through the plantation, through the coconut trees, it was like music being played through the plantation because the trees would just sway in the wind. So, back to the plantation. My grandfather built this plantation and the home, but 100 years ago this year, he was a coal porter for the American Bible Society. I don't know if you know what a coal porter is. A coal porter is someone who publicizes or sells Bibles. So 100 years ago, He was a coal porter in the Philippines. The story of how he becomes a coal porter in the book is an amazing story. Remember, all these stories are true. He would travel by bull cart or by boat to bring the Bible to many islands of the Philippines where no one had ever heard or seen a Bible in their life. He would row his boat for 3 days at a time sometimes and bring the Bible. Portions of the Bible, either a New Testament or the Gospels or portions of Bibles, the Psalms, and get this. It would sell for 2 centavos, and centavos is a penny. That portion of the Bible, that's how much it cost back then, but my grandfather is actually written up in the history journals of the American Bible Society because of what he did, being the very first one to bring the Bible to many islands of the Philippines. That was her heritage. In this next picture, this is the Gent family. My grandfather, of course, the American man right there, my Lola, and the 11 children who survived. 2 of the children died at a young age, but believe it or not, all 11 of them survived World War II, and they were scattered all over the Philippines. That was her heritage. It was a miracle. All these stories are true. But my grandfather, in this next picture, this is the truck he used to drive from town to town, or sometimes it would go on a ferry and go to another island. But in 1933, my mom and her family received the sad news that he had died. He had passed away. He had had a heart attack, and the truck fell over, and he passed away at the age of 56 years old. And she was only this age, 7 years old, when he passed away. So probably some of you have had a parent. You lose a parent at a young age through death or through divorce or something. So she lost her father at the age of 7. Her mother and siblings raised her then before the war broke out in 1941. Now, when the war broke out in 1941, is there a picture? Okay. When the war broke out in 1941, just picture this now. My mom is about 15 years old. The U.S. Army actually take over their plantation as their headquarters. So my mom and her family had to leave the plantation, and the U.S. Army takes over their whole plantation. Then the Japanese invaded Mindanao, and the Japanese took over the plantation from the U.S. Army. At the end of World War II, when it's then liberated by the U.S., the Muslims, the Moros, take over their plantation. And at the end of the war, it's all in the book, they come back to the plantation to see if there was anything left, and nothing had been left. They even buried stuff everything had been ransacked by the Moros. Moros were actually the Muslim group in the Philippines. That's what they're called, because when the Philippines was under Spain for 350 years, that's what they named them. So the Muslims in the Philippines are called the Moros. Okay, our next slide right here, I am going to actually have Wayne talk about Colonel Fertig. This island of Mindanao that I showed you earlier is huge. Like 5 mountain ranges, lots of lakes and streams. And Colonel Fertig, who was the head of the Filipino-American guerrilla force, said, quote, "It was the closest to paradise to him." So Wayne's going to talk a little bit about Colonel Fertig.
Actually, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about it. You probably recognize this General Douglas MacArthur, well-known hero from World War II. His accomplishments in World War II, his time in World War II actually began in the Philippines. He was a military advisor to the Filipinos prior to the start of World War II. And then when the Japanese invaded, he struggled mightily to defend the islands and the U.S. Army personnel there against the advancing Japanese army. But in March of 1942, President Roosevelt ordered him to leave the island, which he did so very reluctantly. the promise he made to his soldiers and to the Filipino people, of course, was the famous phrase, "I shall return." And Cindy will have some information on that a little bit later. Obviously, a promise that he kept. You see the photo there on the right. That's when he waded ashore on the island of Leyte when the U.S. military returned to the Philippines in October of 1944. Again, there's an appendix about General MacArthur in the book, but I want to talk about another U.S. Army officer who fought in the Philippines throughout the entire war. His name was Colonel, or Wendell Fertig. I said Colonel because he was actually a captain in the U.S. Army and a civil engineer when World War II started. And he was promoted twice in 4 months. So by April of 1942, he'd been promoted to major and to lieutenant colonel. His responsibility was to either destroy supplies or facilities that the Japanese could be able to use after their invasion. There's one anecdote where he even drove his own Dodge staff car off a pier into Manila Bay to destroy it rather than leave it. He was sent to the island of Mindanao in April of 1942 to help the forces there construct airfields, because their intention was to establish U.S. military in the island of Mindanao and fight from there. But by the time Fertig got to Mindanao, the U.S. Army had already surrendered to the Japanese. And so he spent the next few weeks trying to figure out what he was going to do. He was on the run with some others. One fleeing officer asked him what they were going to do, and his reply was, "Any damn thing but surrender." The others had surrendered. He refused to. So he wanted to connect with the guerrilla forces there. He realized that to gain authority, he had to wait for them to contact him. Once he got the guerrilla forces organized on the island, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but he wrote this in his diary: "I am called on to lead a resistance movement against an implacable enemy under conditions that make victory barely possible even under the best circumstances. But I feel that I am indeed a man of destiny, that my course is charted, and that only success lies at the end of the trail. I do not envision failure. It is obvious that the odds are against us, but we will not consistently win. But if we are to win only part of the time and gain a little each time, in the end, we will be successful." The emerging guerrilla forces at the time, once the U.S. government there had collapsed, were really simply groups of bandits, each one claiming to fight the Japanese, but really only trying to set themselves up as rulers of local areas on the island. And they were competing with each other for territory and for authority. So in September 1942, the leader of one of those groups actually contacted Colonel Fertig, hoping to use him as a front to give themselves more credibility and assume authority over the entire island. Fertig agreed, except he used his knowledge of the Filipino people and the situation there to eventually not only take over control of that group, but all of the other guerrilla groups as well. He recognized most of them had a senior person that called themselves a colonel, and he realized that, well, if he wanted to have any kind of authority over this collection of guerrilla groups, he needed to outrank them. So he was a lieutenant colonel. He promoted himself to brigadier general. A move that did not endear him to General MacArthur or his staff operating out of Australia. He actually had a Filipino metalsmith take some coins and cut them and fashion stars that he pinned onto his uniform and called himself a general. It took another year before they finally established some tenuous communications with General MacArthur and his staff in Australia. And MacArthur at that point appointed Fertig as a commanding officer of the military district of Mindanao. However, he specifically disallowed any Americans to be promoted to flag officer rank, and so Fertig reduced himself in grade to colonel. However, he continued to wear the brigadier general stars throughout the remainder of the war. He wanted to have credibility with the locals, and so he actually grew a red goatee, believing it would make him look older and wiser. And so the local Filipinos actually began to refer to him as Tatay, which is a Filipino word means the old man. His widely scattered forces across the island eventually numbered 32,000. However, he was facing 50,000 Japanese soldiers that were garrisoned on the island. They were primarily in the cities and towns and in the coastal areas. So what he did was he started doing just hit-and-run raids on various groups in small teams. The Japanese were very frustrated by this, so they tried to destroy him and his guerrilla army. They put together a large force. The Japanese had 50,000 troops, but they only controlled about 5% of the island. The guerrillas controlled the 95% of the interior. So when the Japanese sent their forces into the interior to try to destroy the guerrillas, Fertig's tactic was simply to keep backing up and backing up and backing up and disperse, and the Japanese would then chase them into the jungle and disperse further and further, and then he would have his small teams attack and destroy the small teams of Japanese. And they continued that activity throughout World War II. Fertig actually created a shadow government, again, that covered 95% of the island. He was actually governing Mindanao. They even printed and used their own currency, exclusive of what the Japanese were trying to control at the time. He is widely regarded as a hero by the people, especially on Mindanao, a highly respected figure among the U.S. forces. One authority actually lists him as one of the top 10 guerrilla leaders in human history because of what he accomplished during World War II on that island. And many consider him to be the father of U.S. Special Forces. To tie this back to Cindy's family, these are her 4 uncles. Her mother, again, was the youngest of 11. She had 6 sisters, 4 brothers. The 4 here, her Uncle George, he's the second one from the right. He actually served as a liaison between Colonel Fertig and one or more of the guerrilla groups. And then her Uncle David to the far right actually was a teenager at the time, but he was a driver for the guerrillas, and he taught many escaped Americans how to survive in the jungles of Mindanao. So we talk about Colonel Fertig and the impact that he had, but there were actually direct connections between what he was doing and Cindy's family on the island at the time.
Wow, we are giving you a quiz today after this, okay? Okay, so I had mentioned many American veterans settled in this part of Mindanao, Mamungan. This is about the age right here. This is what my mom looked like when World War II broke out. She's around 15, a young girl, but then by the end of the war, she was 19. So she goes from a young girl to a young woman. She spent 15 years writing memoirs. I spent 2 years writing the book. So in a way, COVID was a blessing because it made me buckle down and write the book. So I self-published the book in 2020. The desire of her heart, though, was to publish that book so that others would know the grace of God. So that is why she titled the book Never Forsaken. She titled the book Years Ago. As I was growing up, my mom would tell me stories about World War II, but I was a teenager. So what happens as a teenager? When something goes in this ear, and it goes right out the other ear, so I didn't pay much attention until I was a young, adult in my 40s. So she started telling me stories about World War II. I'm going to take you back, if we have a few more minutes here, to 1964. And I'm going to read to you 2 paragraphs from the preface of the book. It was August 14th, 1964, when the wheels of the Pan American jetliner touched down at Honolulu International Airport in Hawaii. It had been a very long 20-hour flight from Manila, Philippines, and there were still several more hours of flying before arriving in Los Angeles. On board, an 11-year-old girl and her 10-year-old brother were traveling unaccompanied from the only life they had known in the Philippines to new home and new country. They were escorted down the steps of the airliner by stewardess, which is what they were called back then, guided to a cement bench in the lobby of the outdoor terminal. "Wait here and do not leave this bench," the stewardess told them. "I will be back to get you before we board the plane." While she spoke to both children, her comments were really directed toward the young girl. I was that young girl of 11, almost 12 years old. 2 hours later, that stewardess came back. I heard them saying, "Flight number whatever, boarding." My brother and I sat on that bench, and I remember starting to cry, really trying to keep the tears back, because I had thought she had left us. So that's probably where I get my fear of abandonment. So don't anybody leave before we're done, okay? Because okay. Don't anybody go anywhere. So, but 1964, the political situation was very bad in the Philippines. And my Uncle David, who was the guerrilla, was actually President Marcos's campaign manager on the island of Mindanao because he knew the island so well, knew the Moros so well. Well, he had a falling out with Marcos, so our family was in danger. Within 30 days, my parents decided we should come to the United States since I was an American citizen by birth, so was my mom from my grandfather. So at the age of 11, my mom was very ill from the effects of World War II. Now today, you will know of it as PTSD. Back then, they didn't know what PTSD was. And the treatments for PTSD back then were not something you would want to do today. She was very ill. So at the age of 11, sold all our stuff with the help of some maids. My mom and dad put us on that plane. My brother and I, at the age of 10 and 11, we flew all the way from from the Philippines to Los Angeles, 28-hour flight, all by ourselves. So that is actually how we came to the U.S. And let's see here, the next photo here is actually my Uncle Johnny. And my Uncle Johnny right here, did you want to talk about him for a minute? Okay, my Uncle Johnny right here on the left became actually later after the war Commodore of the Philippine Navy. He was a POW in Manila in the same prison camp as the Bataan March prisoners, Camp O'Donnell. But years later, I can remember going on his yacht, traveling to the Corregidor to go see the island.
Another interesting family story, then Lieutenant Juan Magluyan was a newly commissioned officer in 1941. He was given the responsibility to build 12 new torpedo boats for the Philippine Coastal Patrol. And he was in the process of doing that when the naval base where they were building those in Manila Bay was bombed and all the boats were destroyed. One of the things he wrote in his memoir is that everything except 2 PT boats survived. Those went off to Corregidor. Those were the 2 PT boats that went to Corregidor and picked up Douglas MacArthur and his family and his staff, took them to the island of Mindanao, 600 miles away, and where he was picked up by a B-17 and flown to Australia until he re-engaged, and got back into the fight later in the war. But so Cindy's uncle was right there and saw those 2 PT boats leaving as all his 12 boats had been destroyed.
So, of course, my goal is to get you to read the book. This is the background of the book. Just a couple more things. Our 2 sons were actually very instrumental in my mom writing this book because our son Jason, at the age of 9, wrote an essay called "My Grandma Was a Prisoner of War." And so this encouraged her to write her memoirs. Our other youngest son is an amazing writer, screenplay writer, filmmaker. He wrote 4 allegories in the book. An allegory about my mom in the war and about the Agus River. This river is a very, very dangerous river, but it also ran through the Gent plantation. This is the river where my mom learned how to swim. They would throw her in, and then crocodiles would come, and she said she could see them. Anyway, it was how she learned how to swim, but I'm going to read you just part one, the allegory, and our son wrote the other allegories in the book. So listen carefully. The waters raged beneath her, twisting, writhing, smashing against the rocks, arcs of angry white foam spitting up into the air, only to disappear again into the swirling void. And the sound, the roar like the deep rumble of a beast on the hunt. It never stopped, never ceased, never slowed, always rushing, always raging, uncontainable, unstoppable. Terrifying. The locals said that whenever the river roared, it was claiming a life. Dragging, pulling the head under, arms and legs striving to break through the air above, clawing desperately for one more breath. She looks into the waters, deep into the rushing stream, until everything else fades away, and all that is left is the blue, deafening roar. You will not take me, she thinks, but the waters don't stop. They just keep roaring. So the allegory of this story about the war, before and during, after World War II, is about the Agus River and her life. And then she comes to the end of the war. Her story is amazing, how she reconnects with her father's family in the United States. It's an amazing story. All the stories in the book, of course, are true. But at the end of the war, when the Americans come to liberate the Philippines, my mom sees her friends who have just been released from other concentration camps, other POW camps. And this is what she says at the end of the war. She sees military use trucks all over. She is in fatigues. The clothes that she's given to wear, remember, she had no clothes during the war. One dress, no shoes, nothing. She says, one never knows what freedom is really like until it is lost, if only for a time. When the Americans arrived, they said that freedom is back. That was back in 1945. And quickly, I want to show you this frame. This is a frame that has my grandfather's medals from the Spanish-American War. But the leaflet right here, that's in this frame, is the original leaflet that my Lola, my grandmother, carried throughout the war around her waist. The original leaflet General MacArthur dropped during the war, where it said, I shall return, she carried it around her waist during the war, all those years of the war, along with my grandfather's military papers. If they had ever been found by the Japanese, they would have been shot to death on the spot. My mom had friends where they actually had to dig their own grave, then they were shot and buried in them. So I just want to encourage you to read Never Forsaken. It's a true, amazing story about a young woman's life before, during, after World War II. So we will take some questions. I know we're running a little late. So does anyone have it? Yes, ma'am. Oh, should I? Okay. This is my mom, by the way, at the age of 89 years old, here on the picture on the right. Until the day she went into a coma at the age of 89, she would always tell me, God will never forsake me. So, yes, a question, ma'am? Oh, right there.
I'd like to hear you comment on the concentration camps. We hear a lot about Manzanar. We hear about the Japanese being put in concentration camps here in the United States. But I had a friend who grew up in Manila. Her father ran the Chevrolet agency there, and she grew up in a Philippine concentration camp under the Japanese. We don't hear much about that. We hear what happened here, but not there. I just wonder if you comment on it, tell us a little bit about what you know about the concentration camps that Americans were put in.
Sure, in the Philippines? Yes, my mom was a POW actually at the age of 15. You don't think about that. Think of yourself as a 15-year-old girl. She was a POW, the stories in the book, it's actually incredible. how they end up in the POW camp and how they escape. She would tell me that they were in the camp, and every day, all they had to eat was a bowl of rice broth. So can you imagine how much they lost, how much weight they lost in the POW camp? They had no freedom. They saw soldiers every day with their bayonets, and that's what it was like for them. There were many POW camps in the Philippines, and some of them, the one my uncle was in Manila, Camp O'Donnell, where the Bataan March prisoners were, I can't even explain to you how horrible it was. The story's in the book, because his story of being a POW is also in there. The way they were treated in the camp in the Philippines.
There was also a POW camp in Manila at one of the universities that was used largely to house civilians rather than the military. But so there were several camps scattered through the Philippines.
Any more questions? Yes, ma'am. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, my grandparents are buried somewhere in Manila, first in Mindanao, and then moved over to the Manila Cemetery. Anyone else? Any more? Yes, ma'am.
Is this on? The assistant to General MacArthur was the last mayor of Los Angeles, Sam Yorty.
Oh.
That interesting. My husband's uncle and my uncle were both on the Bataan Death March. So
wow.
Claude, my husband, saved an investment for the Philippines and was invited to the Philippines to be honored there and receive an honorary doctorate. But while we were there, Claude and I tried to walk the Bataan Death March that my uncle was on. The only reason he survived is because he knew enough Japanese to say, "Good morning, Japanese soldier," and they spared his life. But when he was freed, he weighed 97 pounds. Claude and I couldn't walk the Bataan Death March.
In the book, I will tell you that there is another story. There is another death march most people have never heard about, and it's in the book, and it's actually on the island of Mindanao. So that's also in the book, but thank you for sharing that. Yes. The camp, I know we got to stop. The POW camp my uncle was in, the one who became Commodore of the Philippine Navy, Camp O'Donnell, they said 26,000 Filipino soldiers died in that camp, and about 15,000 American soldiers just in that one camp. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. My question is, closer. My question is about today on NTD TV. I saw that the Chinese have battleships off the shores of the Philippines right now, and they're threatening the fishermen, and they're saying it belongs to China. So today, what are they doing to thwart this threat from China?
Well, you know, the U.S. military is still involved in the Philippines. I mean, Clark Air Force Base closed down due to the volcano eruption, but they still do a lot of military exercises there. And actually, the new president, I don't know a lot about him, but he is the son of Ferdinand Marcos. So he is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And on a personal note, I don't think there's anybody here as a part of my family, but I'm just kidding. My cousin, my Aunt Mary, who married the Commodore of the Philippine Navy, her daughter actually was the governess for this president of the Philippines today. She was the governess for the two children of President Marcos. So I have a lot of interesting connections to the Philippines. Any other questions? Oh, yes. My husband, he tells me I have quite a number of shoes. So, Not like Imelda Marcos. And not like Imelda Marcos, but you know, she was beautiful. She was like Miss Manila, Miss Philippines back then. So, thank you everyone for letting us share your book, our book.
You are beautiful too, Cindy. Thank you, Cindy and Wayne. That was a fabulous, fabulous presentation. And honestly, the book is fabulous. It's so good. I read it in 2 days. All right, so that was fabulous, wasn't it? Again, thank you, Cindy and Wayne, for coming all the way to Laguna Woods. And we so enjoyed it.